Hello, I'm Stephanie Hamlet. My son was diagnosed with autism in the fall of 2007. I initially felt bludgeoned by the diagnosis, then overwhelmed by the flood of information. I read scores of books, volunteered at the school, and after 1.5 years of research and investigation, I implemented a diet change for my son and family, a gluten-free, casein-free diet. This week marks a year since the dietary intervention. My son now attends a full-day mainstream kindergarten. He is thriving academically, socially, developmentally, and medically. I didn't intend this to happen, but now I am an accidental gluten-free chef. I would like to share what I learned with you. I hope that the cooking instruction and hints that I give you will help you as much as it has helped my family lead a healthier life. I will be baking a special bread which is gluten-free and casein-free. Gluten is found primarily in wheat and casein is found primarily in dairy. And some people cannot eat these foods, so I will be baking a special bread that does not contain either of these foods. And I will be starting by warming the water. The water should be about a bath water temperature. And I've found after baking several bad loaves of bread that the yeast tends to get a very good start when you add honey or sugar to it. So what I will be doing is adding 2¼ teaspoons of yeast to this. My next ingredient to add to the yeast to get it going will be 2 teaspoons of honey. I free pour, that's about 2 teaspoons. I've made this recipe many times. I'll stir it in, and while I'm mixing the other ingredients into the bowl of the stand mixer, this yeast will be incubating. Ideally it should foam slightly and it's ready to add to the dry mixture. In addition to this, I will add a ½ teaspoon of vinegar. And the yeast is already beginning to foam, so it looks as if we're on our way. The next ingredient will be the 2 cups of baking mix, which is shown on page 40 of Betty Hagman's The Gluten-Free Gourmet Bakes Bread. I will next add xanthan gum and unflavored gelatin. The unflavored gelatin I use is the Knox brand, and the xanthan gum can be bought in health food stores. There's 1 teaspoonful of gelatin and 1½ teaspoons of xanthan gum. My next ingredient is a dairy substitute. Since casein or dairy products are not part of my diet or my son's, I have used a substitution called Vance's Dairy Free, also available at health food stores. For those of you who can tolerate dairy, the recipe indicates the use of dry milk powder. Next ingredient is an egg replacer, and eggs are normally listed as a wet ingredient, but since eggs are somewhat at issue in our diets, there is something called Energy Foods egg replacer, also available at health food stores. I use it dry, and to compensate for the fact that it is not a wet ingredient in this case, I add sometimes a little bit of extra water as needed. I'll explain that later as the mixture gets put together. This is a tablespoon plus a teaspoon of egg replacer that's used in the recipe. Next ingredient is ½ teaspoon of salt and 2 teaspoons of sugar, which gets added to the bread mix as dry ingredients, and I will install it into the stand. The nice thing about KitchenAids is that they have a lot of strength and they lock into position. You can walk away from it while it mixes. I do have a mixing shield because this is an important feature. The mixer moves very hard and fast. As you can see, the yeast has begun to foam. It's been having a chemical reaction with the water and the honey. So it is ready to use. The bread will start rising as soon as this gets added to the dry ingredients. Next, I will add this to the bowl with the dry ingredients. And my final ingredient to add will be 3 tablespoons of oil. The original recipe calls for margarine. Again, this could contain some dairy products, and people on special diets are not always tolerant of this. So this calls for 3 tablespoons of margarine. I choose to use olive oil or canola oil instead. There's my 3 tablespoon quantity, and I'm now ready to mix. Okay. This part gets very messy. I put on the pouring shield. I didn't pour through it, but I use it when I mix. The flour tends to fly away quite a bit, so I like to cover it and then turn it on. We always get a little dust cloud at this stage. I'd like to have a look at the flour mixture now. It's kind of thick. It should ideally have the consistency of cake batter, according to the author's recommendations in this book. So it is now time for me to add a little more water to the mixture. Every recipe needs a small amount of adjustment. So here I am ready to add some more water. Since the batter does not look enough like cake batter, this is not your traditional bread dough. It never gets as thick as the wheat flour. I'll be adding a little bit of water to this as I mix and just watching what kind of shape it takes as I go. It takes a couple minutes for this to mix and start looking like something. You can always turn up the speed if you need to. And it is thinning out. It's starting to look more the way it should look. I think I'm going to need a little more water, and it's okay if you add water to the dirty cup. It's fine. It's all the same yeast. More water is being added now. This is beginning to look a little more like cake batter. Turn up the speed as is needed and keep adding water. Keep in mind that I did not use eggs, but instead I substituted with a powdered egg replacer, and that makes it necessary to add more water than what is originally called for in this recipe. This now looks a lot like cake batter, and I'll give it a little more mixing in order to get all the lumps worked out, and we look as if we're in pretty good shape. Now it's time for me to take the bowl out of the mixer. The mixing is complete, and I have a cake batter consistency in my bread dough. So I'll just clear everything off the beater here and take it over to the table and put it into the loaf pan. I have to prepare my loaf pan still by greasing and flouring it. I'm out of the mixer now. My next step is to prepare my loaf pans, and for that I need to grease it and flour it. So I'm greasing it with margarine. Again, if the margarine is a problem, if there are any allergens in this, you can always substitute with oil. Following this, I'll sprinkle rice flour into it. I recycle several containers. This used to be a fiber supplement container. Pat it around, get all of the flour coating evenly on the greased areas. This is important because the bread has to slide out after it's done. You're dealing with a different consistency altogether. I'll just dump it there and get it out of the way. My next step now is to take the batter-like bread dough. This is a hard thing to get used to when you first learn how to bake gluten-free items, because when you're accustomed to dealing with wheat flour, it has a much thicker, congealed texture to it. Now you really get to get into things and get your hands dirty. You can either take the margarine that you used previously. I coat parchment paper. Betty Hagman in her book suggests that you coat aluminum foil, but things containing metal that touch food can be problems for autistic people. So you can coat that parchment paper with either oil or margarine, whatever is tolerable is okay, and then put a little oil on your hands and mold that bread dough. Since it is a different consistency, we have to get rid of this little mountain range on top of everything here and disperse it evenly throughout the loaf pan. You need to disperse the dough evenly in the loaf pan. This is why my hands are oiled, so that I don't stick to it. The next step is to put the greased side of the parchment on top of this. And again, if aluminum foil is no problem, you may use that, but I choose not to. Now I will be taking it to the oven and letting it rise for 35 minutes. I leave it on top of the burners to let it rise. I'm just going to leave it to rise in a warm place, which is on top of my preheated oven. Incidentally, the oven has to be preheated to 400 degrees. My oven runs hotter. I have a very efficient gas oven, and I have to set mine down to 375. Anybody who's used their oven more than 4 or 5 times can figure it out. I learned after baking a few bad experiments that I had to dial it down. You learn this as you go. It will stay here for 35 minutes. I'm going to set a timer, and when the timer rings, my 35 minutes is up, or when the bread is nearly level with the top of the pan, whichever comes first. When the baking is completed, the bread should look mostly like this. This has a little cave-in. It's not perfect. I usually bake better bread when nobody is filming me. The bread will bake 50 to 60 minutes at 375 or 400, depending on your oven. It just so happens that my oven needs 375 degrees and a 50-minute baking time. This is what works for me. You will find out as you go along and sometimes destroy things that you need to change your timing as well. This is a loose guideline. The bread, when it's done baking, should slip out of the pan easily, and it's very important to remember that when you take it out of the baking pan, do not leave it for more than 5 minutes sitting in the pan. It will get steamy and soggy, so be sure you turn it out onto a rack right away and let it cool for approximately 1.5 to 2 hours prior to cutting it. Alright, it's time to have a look at the bread. It is near the level, level with the top at the pan, and this means that it's time for it to go in the oven. It will continue to rise as it bakes, and I'll be placing it in the oven for 50 minutes at 375 degrees in my oven. Set the timer for that 50-minute baking time. So I'll set aside the timer. And one thing I'd like to add about baking these breads is it takes some time and some organization and preparation. It can be very overwhelming to have to deal with a diet change. I use coffee cans, more recycling. I do about 4 of these a week, and I set aside my dry ingredients only in the coffee can, and I have it all labeled as Featherlight rice bread, dry ingredients, and then I have a note to myself to add yeast, water, vinegar, oil, and honey. So when it comes time to bake it, I typically will start something up at about 6 in the morning, make some coffee, get my bread mixed, let it rise, and I'll go get ready for my day. And by the time I take my son to school, we have fresh bread sitting cooling on the counter. So that's how I organize. It might help you to know this. My next recipe that I'm going to share with you will be chicken nuggets. And you may already have noticed that I'm not really a gourmet cook. I like to keep things geared towards common sense use of foods in the kitchen. We like to deal with foods that kids enjoy eating. I'm using 3 different kinds of flours in my mixture. I start with 1.5 cups of total 3 flours, using cornstarch, tapioca flour, and white rice flour. I'll be placing those in the measuring cup, and they'll be set aside for a few moments while I talk about the egg mixture. For those of you who can tolerate eggs, you may use 1 egg with a little bit of water if you feel you need to thin it out, and a tablespoon of lemon juice. For those who cannot tolerate eggs, I have an alternative, as I suggested during my bread recipe. The Egg Replacer by Energy Foods, which I mentioned, is the one I recommend for people who need an egg substitution. And what I've done here is I've pre-mixed it. I'm going to place it in a bowl, and it's 1 tablespoon of egg replacer, 3 tablespoons of water, and 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. Now what I'll be doing is scraping this out of the bowl, giving it a little last-minute mix, and putting it into the chicken, which I have already prepared. This chicken has had all its fat and other little gnarly parts trimmed off, so it's ready to become chicken tenders once it gets coated. Alright, we all know that chicken can be a little bit nasty to touch. I don't like scrubbing this stuff out of my nails, so I always have gloves handy for this dirty job. Whenever you handle raw chicken, you should also have some bleachy water handy in order to clean your hands properly. This is my mixture of the egg replacer, the water, and the lemon juice. Gets a little gunky, so I like to scrape it out of the container. And you just mix it in with the raw chicken, making sure that everything gets a good coating, good even coating. This is enough to coat probably 2 pounds of chicken pretty easily. I don't have very much with me today because I'm just keeping things small. Now, alternately, you may do chicken piccata. So if you feel like having a more adult dinner than chicken tenders or chicken nuggets, you may pound these out flat. My tool of choice is the rubber mallet, which I sometimes use for upholstery. I like things that don't take up too much space in a kitchen drawer. Okay, things will get noisy. Here it goes. I'm going to pound this chicken out very flat. Keeping it enclosed in a bag prevents splatters, and pounding it out flat will ensure that it cooks evenly and more quickly. So that will be the next thing I coat. First, I will start with the chicken tenders. I've gotten myself a larger bowl. I'm going to be using this for my dry mixture, my flour and my breadcrumbs. The flour that I previously measured in half-cup increments goes into this bowl. An assortment of spices, I vary it a little bit. I used some cayenne pepper, a couple of dashes, about a half teaspoon of garlic, oregano, same quantity, half teaspoon, some onion powder, and some sage. Also a half teaspoon of everything except for the cayenne. You don't want to overdo that, it would be too hot. If you want it to taste more Italian, you can cut down on the heat and increase the oregano. I also have 1 cup of breadcrumbs, which I have saved from the bread which I bake when it goes stale. Never waste it. This gets to be very expensive if you buy breadcrumbs at the health food stores, so you should just save your bread crust, whatever goes stale, and let it dry out, and you can put it in the food processor and chop it. You may also use corn chips. As long as there's no gluten-containing grain used in those corn chips, you can buzz those if you have a few left over in your bag. This is a very easygoing recipe. I like to mix things with my hands because it's the perfect tool. I have gloves on, so what if things get dirty? And make sure that everything has a nice uniform consistency. So once you get the flour and the breadcrumbs and the spices mixed, you should see, a nice even spotting of spices and sort of a beigey color. Next, I'll take the chicken, which I have already coated and prepared, and just going to drop all the pieces with a little bit of space between them straight into the flour mixture. I've gotten myself a couple of plates to transfer everything onto after the chicken is evenly coated, so it's gone into the wet mixture and it has been dragged through the flour mixture and breadcrumbs and spices, and I will just set it aside on the plate and it will be ready to cook in a moment. After this, I'll take care of the piccata. So I'll take those last few pieces that I did of the chicken nuggets, get that next round done. I've tested the oil. When the oil is hot enough to deep fry, you test it by flicking a little bit of water into it, and if it sizzles and crackles, it's ready to go. Next, I'll take care of my piccata portions. There's just enough of this dipping mixture left to take care of the coatings I need for those. Same as before, in and out of the dry stuff. These piccata portions that I'm doing now can be made up tonight into dinner if I have enough time, or I can just go ahead and freeze them on a cookie sheet with some wax paper or plastic and save them for another night when I maybe need a good quick answer to that what's for dinner question. They do very well in the freezer. Make sure you freeze them on a sheet nice and flat though, because they are coated and they'll stick to other stuff if you don't have something to separate them. I just like to rub the excess junk off my gloves, and from here I'm going to go directly to the stove, establish my oil temperature correctly, and now I'll just drop these in and let them cook. I do between 4 and 6 at a time in a pan this small, and you should never leave this unattended. You need to always be babysitting this hot oil for safety reasons. When the chicken is done cooking, you'll see a color change, and sometimes when there's less bubbling, you'll actually see a little bit of clear juice coming off it. If you're not sure what you're seeing, you can turn the heat a little lower until the bubbles subside. And if you really need to have a look at it, you can pick up a piece. Generally, the chicken goes from that pink to a nice white color. The coating will get nice and brown. And if you ever worked a part-time job at a restaurant, you pretty much know what that looks like. All right, so I just keep flipping things over. Okay, this will cook for about 3 minutes. 375 for about 3.5 minutes seems to be what works best when you're deep frying something, when you have to take the chicken from a raw to a cooked state. The chicken has turned a nice golden brown color, and it's underneath you can see that the meat is turned white. I don't believe there are any soft spots inside. Also, my intention for this chicken is to freeze it for future use. I make larger batches because this does make a mess of your kitchen. You don't want to be repeating that scene too often. So as it cooks and cools and drains, I will let it cool off entirely. May have some for dinner tonight, who knows. And the remainder can be saved in the freezer by the same method. Freeze it on some plastic on a tray or a cookie sheet, and then once it's frozen solid, you can put it into bags and label it. This has no eggs, no gluten, and of course no casein. And it is quite acceptable for anybody on the autism spectrum to eat. So it's nice that this kind of food can include somebody socially at the dinner table, even when other people are on unrestricted diets. It's a very social food. It's something like junk food, and it makes kids happy. Now I'm ready to cook my piccata portions. I'm just going to pour in a little extra oil. It's looking a little dry. You can use olive or canola. True Italian cooks like to use olive oil, so I'll try to be authentic. Put these piccata pieces in. There's a little bit of heat in there. Okay, that will cook, and I'll go back to babysitting my chicken nuggets. As this chicken piccata looks, it has to go through the same series of color change and golden brown look as the chicken nuggets, only I'll be picking it up with a spatula, flipping it over, making sure both sides are cooked. By the same methods, it can be frozen on a tray with plastic and used for a later time. Like I said, even if they're a little bit raw in the middle, if you're not, you're going to reheat them in the oven anyway. Okay, the chicken has finished cooking. It's time to take it off the heat. So I am just letting it drain the same way as I did with the nuggets. 2 very beautiful chicken piccata portions. I'll set that aside. I'd like to add as I close that this oil can be recycled. So the oil, I won't use that because there's too little of it. But when you have some depth in the pan and you've been deep frying, you can recycle the oil by straining it. You strain the crumbs out. I have a funnel with a strainer, but you may also use one of those single cup coffee makers that you put a filter into. There are a lot of ways to filter it out. So I'm just going to pour off my old oil into a canning jar because they can take the high heat. And I have storage lids for my canning jars. So I'll just pour this through the funnel, and you can save this as long as you reuse it in a month. So be sure to put a label on the lid and make sure you use it in a month. And on that same thought, you may also use the crumb coating mixture if you have enough of it left over. Also use that within a month. For safety reasons, I choose to freeze it since it has come into contact with raw chicken. So throw it in a zip bag and freeze it. And keep your dry stuff. You can use it again. Bread goes stale, so do not let this go to waste. You can dry out these bread pieces, cut them about 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick, let them dry out in the air or even in the leftover heat of the oven after you're done baking something. Break them into a few small chunks so that they're easier for the food processor or chopper to take care of. Then you can transfer them into the chopper, and this saves you quite a few dollars at the health food store. Last time I checked, these things were about $6 for a 4-ounce tin. And I can have stale bread for free. Dump them in and chop them up. That provides you with breadcrumbs for your next batch of whatever the... Okay, so that provides you with enough crumbs for whatever the next batch of something you're making that calls for them. Okay, this concludes our recycling of various ingredients involved with coating chicken. You've made chicken piccata, chicken nuggets successfully. You now know what to do with those breadcrumbs so that you can use them anytime you want to coat chicken. And there are other recipe ideas to come using those same breadcrumbs. So make sure you keep them. And today's episode will be cooking meatloaf. In the previous show about cooking chicken piccata and chicken nuggets, I told you to save your breadcrumbs and chop them down so that they can be used in other recipes. This is one of those recipes. We use breadcrumbs in the meatloaf. I'll be putting the ingredients into the mixer. What I'll be starting with is 1 pound of ground sirloin. Next, I'll be putting in 1/2 cup of the breadcrumbs. This particular meatloaf is going to have a barbecue flavor. I've chosen barbecue sauce to feature with it. So I have a 1/4 cup of barbecue sauce. For anybody who's extremely intolerant of gluten, you may find that the vinegar in the barbecue sauce does not agree with you. And if that is the case, you may reference the ketchup recipe in Lisa Lewis's Special Diets for Special Kids, the first book. So I'm starting with 1/2 cup broth. This is just no MSG soup broth. I happen to like horseradish, so I put a tiny bit of wasabi. This is very much an optional thing. It's too hot for some people. I like it, and my kid doesn't complain. So I use a little bit in there, about a 1/4 teaspoon mixed with the broth. So 1/2 cup of that, 1/2 cup of barbecue sauce. I use 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, and I put cumin with this. That's optional, 1/2 teaspoon of cumin if you do use it. If you're using fresh garlic, use about 2 teaspoons. It's wet, it takes up more space. Last item is pureed onion, about 1/2 of a medium-sized onion. I puree it because my son doesn't like the texture of chopped onion. So it's easier to hide and add flavor this way. I'll be turning on the mixer now and making some noise. This is a strong mixer, so it's necessary to start it at a low speed or you'll get what I just got. Okay. It looks as if it's finished mixing, so time to turn it off. And over to the table. I'll be putting it into the pans. These get a coating of olive oil with a basting brush to prepare the surface, and then I'll dump everything out of the mixer into these pans as soon as I'm finished coating. So a quick brush of oil is all you need. Okay. Okay, I'll just finish by smoothing it into the pan. And this will go into the oven and bake at 375 degrees for 45 minutes to 1 hour. Usually 45 minutes is enough when you have things in smaller pans because they're less dense. Okay, I'll be loading these little pans onto a tray so that they're easier to pull out when they're finished and hot. Okay, now I'm ready to put the meatloaf into the oven, 375 degrees for 45 to 60 minutes. And done. Well, the meatloaf is in the oven, and this concludes our recipe for today, and I hope that everybody has learned a little and you're not so worried about trying this diet. Thank you for joining me in my kitchen, and we hope that you tune in again in the future. Now that you have seen how I prepare a few basic menu items, I hope you have the confidence and courage to take on the diet change. Every change brings with it a form of upheaval, but the outcome is what you should focus on. A gluten-free, casein-free diet isn't necessarily for everyone, but if it provides some relief from discomfort and helps make your child more functional, you will be glad you did it. Be well and happy.